One of my favorite things in the world to do is watch Friends. I know it's been off for years and years. It's not even around, but I still find myself binge watching old episodes. And I was thinking about this today and thinking, it's the predictability of the friends in the circle, right? You have Chandler with his quirkiness, Monica with her type A of just everything has to be so neat and tidy and organized. It's Phoebe's ability to make you laugh at her silly songs. Ross always comes in with those smart comments, and Joey and him and his food, like it is just so hilarious. And of course, Rachel, she just brings everybody together, and it's just such this beautiful, cohesive team of people. And it's why I wanted to come on and share with you today that I have an opportunity for you to find your friends in the content creation space. So if you are thinking about creating your first or your next digital course, I don't want you to miss this opportunity because Amy Porterfield just opened the doors for registration for her Course Confident Bootcamp. And I'm actually offering a special bonus for anyone that registers for the Course Confident Bootcamp through my special link. So I want you to go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register. That's crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And what you're going to find when you get there is I have this special bonus private podcast series. It's called Money Mindset for Creators. So I want you to go register for Amy's bootcamp, download the podcast, and immediately start listening to it, because what this training is set up to do is to help you get your mind right about monetizing your content, making money so that you can fuel your content creation dreams. So go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register for Course Confident. And I cannot wait for you to find your friends and find the people that will be there for you. Do you see what I did there? Yeah, nice little friends segue connection. Go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And I cannot wait to see you inside. Okay, let's get into today's episode. One of the things that I love about podcasting as it continues to evolve and change and just turn into just a very different platform in like what we're doing today on this show looks totally different than what it looked like way back in the day when I first got started. But something that does not go out of style is taking questions from the community. Yes, we are answering a question from the community today that actually came from my YouTube channel. So let's get a little meta for a second and talk about when I'm teaching things on this podcast and I'm sharing different things, I'm also trying to show you the strategy for things that you can do in your own content. So if you're struggling to come up with ideas, you're like, I don't know what to talk about, I don't know where to get a new idea from, I'm using today's podcast episode from a question that I got on my YouTube channel. And it's going to turn into a YouTube video. And y'all know I'm like the repurposing queen, I guess. I've had several people call me this, but I don't typically call myself that because it's kind of one of those weird things. But I'm excited to dive into this question today, so let's get right to it. Welcome to the Profit Podcast, where we teach you how to start, launch, and market your content with confidence. I'm your host, Crystal Profit, and I'm so excited that you're here. Thanks for hanging out with me today, because if you've been trying to figure out the world of content creation, this is the show that will help be your time-saving shortcut. So let's get right to it, shall we? Okay, so today's question from the community comes from Jim Apple over on YouTube. Thank you so much for your question, Jim. And this is just kind of a PSA for anybody that is on my YouTube channel. Y'all, I listen to and hear and see every single one of your comments. It's why I'm always saying, hey, if you have questions, put them in the comments. I actually read them and I respond to them. It takes me a little bit. I'm not going to lie. I'm not like, as soon as you post it, I'm going to answer it in the next hour. But I do go read every single comment on my YouTube channel. So if you've watched any videos and you're like, oh man, I have a follow-up question, I want to know about it, like go leave a comment on my YouTube channel and I will read it, and it could potentially turn into another piece of content like this podcast today or a future YouTube video. So that's just a little PSA for those of you that are creating content and you want to know how to engage with your people. Answer comments. It's so simple. Okay, Jim, let's get into your question. So Jim says, how many times should you or a guest on your podcast mention their podcast during an interview? And this is such a good question. So thank you again, Jim Apple, for your question. Okay, this is one of those situations that I have learned how to be better at this over time. Because the worst thing is, and I'm talking, let's take like two approaches to this, right? Let's take consuming content, being a podcast listener, watching content on YouTube, seeing stuff on social media. We're going to take that approach, being a consumer of content. And then we're also going to look at it being the host and looking for guests in your content, etc., and also being a guest. So I guess there's kind of a multifaceted three-way approach to it instead of just two-way. But first, I want to start with what this looks like as you going on to someone else's show. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to be annoying. Okay, I'm gonna answer this one like from myself. I've annoyed myself. Yes, I've listened to podcast episodes in the past where I was like, oh my gosh, why did you say that like 6 times? No one cares. You can say it once, maybe twice, but no one cares that you did whatever you did. Like I have repeated myself, not in a good way, not in a helpful way. And I go back and I listen to it and I'm like, oh my gosh, you sound like an idiot. So don't do that. You'll know what I'm talking about. And some of you are nodding along like, yeah, I've had that experience too. But from the host perspective, if I'm actively in the middle of a conversation with someone, right? We are having a podcast interview and all they want to do is talk about themselves, talk about their product, talk about their business, plug their podcast, plug their book, talk about their event. Like it's not helpful. And at the end of the day, for me as a host of a show, all I want to do is add value to my audience. So you can plug your stuff all you want. It's likely going to get cut. Okay. And y'all know this. If you listen to this podcast, you know I don't do a ton of editing, but maybe this is my passive aggressive way of saying you're not going to get all that stuff into an interview if someone blatantly comes on and is spamming all of their stuff in an episode. It doesn't often happen. I will say that on this podcast in particular, with my experience of doing hundreds of interviews, I don't typically have this happen, and there's a reason. I have a very specific vetting process for people that come onto my show. And there's a great podcast episode. If you haven't listened to it, it is how to be selective with your podcast guest. And it's so funny. It's one of those that I still remember whenever I recorded that episode. And I remember it because it was COVID. Like it was actually the week before COVID shut down everything. We were on spring break. I still remember this to this day because it's just one of those episodes that stuck with me. And it's because I reference it all the time. When someone is like, oh, I had this one person on my show, I'll get DMs, emails from people that are like, there's this one person that they came on my podcast and all they did was talk about themselves. They didn't add anything of value. They didn't teach. They didn't offer tips. They didn't offer resources. They just talked about how amazing they were. And I kind of giggle to myself, right? I don't like, I'm not going to laugh in your face and say, I told you so, unless I actually told you so. Like we had a conversation, like one of my friends that this happened to, I'd be like, go back through your pitching process, right? How did this person come to you? Because I can almost guarantee you there was some sort of language in that person's pitch where all they did was talk about themselves the whole time. This is a red flag. It's a red flag. And this is what I really talk about in this episode when I'm talking about how to be selective with your podcast guests. Like, it's so important that you spot these people from a mile away, from 100 miles away, whenever all they are doing is talking about themselves. Because what do you think if they're doing that in a pitch, in an Instagram DM or an email to you 17 times, and they're talking about, I'm so amazing, I've made millions of dollars, and I'm Forbes' top 2 people in the world, and I'm like, I don't care. I really do not care. If you can't offer any kind of value to my audience, sorry about ya. I do not care, and you're not going to get on my podcast. I know, it's pretty harsh. It's pretty harsh. And I've had people tell me like, wow, you really don't. I'm like, yeah, because I won't just let anybody on my show. Okay, so I know I went on a big tangent, big rant about this, but it's something that's very important to me. And I hope that you take that same kind of precaution with the people that come onto your show, because if they're spammy in a pitch, they're going to be spammy on the interview. All right. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, first rant over, now we're going to talk about how you can actually talk about your show. Because Jim, if you're listening, you're like, Crystal, you did not answer my question, not even a little bit. I know we're baby stepping into it because we do need to talk about this, because it's really important that you as a guest don't just go on and blab about your show the entire time. It's not helpful. So I'm going to reread Jim's question because we're going to get into it. His question is, how many times should you or a guest on your podcast mention their podcast during an interview?
Being a woman in business comes with its own unique set of challenges, but also so many opportunities. We get ahead by leaning in to what makes us different from business as usual. I'm Samantha Hartley, host of Profitable Joyful Consulting, inviting you to a special 6-episode series exploring the experience of being a woman in business. You want to hear from women consultants who've hit $1 million, who sell 6-figure engagements, or who've broken their own revenue ceilings? Yeah, those are my clients, and they'll be sharing too. Join me for 6 must-listen episodes that tackle key challenges for women consultants. Follow Profitable Joyful Consulting on your favorite podcast app.
And there is a few different ways that you can go about this. You can just tell yourself, I'm not going to mention anything about my show unless the host asks me. Because, and this is where it's going to really play into you're doing your own research on the podcast that you're going on. Because you can go back and listen to other podcast interviews that they've done. Do they ask the guest their show? Like, do you have a podcast? Where can people find you? Like, if you've listened to interviews on this podcast, you know at the very end, I'm going to say, well, where can everybody learn more about you or find your content or connect with you? There's always a question at the end of the interview where I give my guests the opportunity to plug their podcast, to share their Instagram handle, to talk about their website, to share their business, like whatever. It's kind of a free-for-all at the end of every single interview on the Profit Podcast. But not all shows are created equal. And you need to know, do I have the opportunity to plug my podcast at the very end? And if you do, then I think that it is like a good measure to mention at the very beginning of your conversation. Maybe you could say, yeah, I host, like as your part of your introduction, because there's usually a little bit of introduction back and forth where you say, oh, this is who I am. And you can segue into the name of your podcast, what your podcast is about, whatever you want to mention. But after that, I think it's a little much if you continue to say the full name of your podcast, who it's for, what it's about throughout the entire conversation. I think if you mention it 5 times, way overdone it. 4 times, I don't know, maybe 3 is pushing it, but I think 2 is totally acceptable. Now, the only reason why I'm saying 2 is because you asked straight out, how many times should you or a guest mention your podcast during an interview? I think 2 is great. And by 2, I mean the full name of your show. But how do we get around this? I think what you should do, and I'm really thinking about my good friend Heather Sager. So shout out to Heather. You should go listen to her podcast because she has all the amazing strategies for speaking on stages and speaking on podcasts and just all the things to do with talking. But I know one thing that she talks about is the different ways that you can describe what you do without fully saying, I'm the host of the Profit Podcast, or I have a podcast. It's called the Profit Podcast. Like, how could you say that in a different way? And I have a few examples of this. So if I wanted to mention multiple times that I host a podcast, well, how could I say that? I could say, when I'm doing interviews on my show, do you see that? I didn't say I host a podcast. I didn't even say the word podcast in there. I said, when I'm doing interviews on my show, that's giving me the ability to talk about my podcast in a way that I'm not even saying host and I'm not saying podcast. All right. And then I have another one. It's when I speak to guests on my show. When I'm trying to find guests to come onto my show, I could go even further. And I'm going to have a few of these examples listed in the show notes. So make sure you go to crystalprofit.com/episode 354 because I'm going to have some examples listed. So that was for a podcast host. The same goes for if you're a coach. I want you to learn, like maybe you offer services or you offer a digital course, or maybe you work one-on-one with people. I want you to do some like language puzzles and say, how can I say that I'm a coach without saying that I'm a coach, right? Maybe you could say, when I'm working with clients, right? Because that like just makes the subliminal messaging like, oh, she must coach people, or she works with people. That must mean that I could hire her to do something. It's that like subliminal messaging that you have where you are talking about your stuff without blatantly calling it out. And I think that this is really smart, especially for those of you that do want to guest on more podcasts. And you're like, I want to make sure that I talk about my stuff. But again, we're not calling it out every single time. You're not bringing everything back to, well, on episode 354 of the Profit Podcast, I spoke about blah, blah, blah. Like it gets really weird and awkward. And let's just be honest, that's not how you would talk to someone. And I think that the best podcast interviews are the ones where they are a natural conversation or they're a natural extension of a conversation where you just feel like you're sitting there. You're a fly on the wall listening to what these 2 or 3 people are talking about and not like someone's crafting a sales pitch. Because that's what I feel like. Whenever I'm listening to a podcast, I have turned ones off where I thought it was like, it's a great show. I always love the host and the people they bring on, but every once in a while, they'll have one wild card that comes out and it's like, wow, you are just a walking billboard. I feel like if I were to go to follow anything that you do, I would just feel like you're going to sell to me every single platform that I engage with you on, whether it's YouTube, your email list, whatever. I just feel like I'm going to get sold to, and sorry, I don't care about you that much. Like we didn't click that much for me to be that engaged with what you're doing. And you don't want that to happen. So you have to find the balance of offering value, which should be your utmost priority in anything that you do. That's just like my life principle. In anything that you do, offer value. But I think that it's really important that you come at and maybe even practice how you talk about what you do in a way that is multiple versions of the same thing. That way you don't just keep saying, as the host of the Profit Podcast and on this particular episode, like that just, it doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel like a normal conversation. So that's the next thing I want to talk about is like figure out ways to switch the wording up to where you can organically insert what you do or the name of your show, that you host a show, and just different versions of how you can talk about your content in a very organic way. Now, the last thing that I want to cover is having strategic calls to action that you can use at the end of the episode or the conversation. Because like I said, I tell all of my guests, like before we hit record, I let them know, hey, at the very end of the episode or at the end of the interview, I'm going to give you a chance to plug your website, your podcast, like all the things. And naturally, I think that this is a very natural approach most people have is you want to say all the different ones. You want to tell them about your lead magnet and your business and the digital course that you just created and that you just created a YouTube channel and they should follow you on Instagram and LinkedIn and check out what you're doing on Pinterest and get on your email list. Like, don't do that. Okay? I mean, if you haven't heard this before, please do not do that. You need to have one strategic call to action. And the thing for me that I have found out works really, really well is telling people about my podcast. Why is that? Why does that work so well? Well, because in my podcast, I mention things like the fact that I have a YouTube channel or I have a new lead magnet or that people should get on my email list to get my weekly Friday emails, and that I have great videos on YouTube, and they can see those by going to the show notes that I mentioned in my podcast. Do you see how my podcast is a tool? It is a tool here that I use, but I don't have to tell people about all of those other things in order for them to get exposed to it. My goal in being a guest on someone else's show is to strategically call out the name of my podcast, who it's for, and what type of value I can add to that particular audience. So whether this means you create a landing page just for your podcast, or you say, you should check out the Profit Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. That's a very simple call to action because I'm not telling you to go to my website I've had many people that are like, hi, I don't know how to spell your name, Crystal, spelled with a K. Then Profit has 2 F's and 2 T's. Like, it's not a very easy name to spell if you have never seen my name on Instagram or YouTube or anywhere else. You would probably misspell it, get frustrated, and be like, you know what, screw it. I don't even know. I just tell people it's called the Profit Podcast. Profit spelled with 2 F's and 2 T's. You can listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. So I encourage you to create some sort of strategic call to action that you can give on every single podcast interview that you do, because it's going to streamline that process of getting people to your show, getting them exposed to your content, and helping them have just a great overall experience. So I want to reiterate one more time Jim's question. I'm going to read it once again, okay? Jim's question, Jim Apple from YouTube says, how many times should you or a guest on your podcast mention their podcast during an interview? Jim, I'm going to say it again. I think once at the beginning and once at the end is great. But I also want to see you working in language that really just helps you set yourself apart from other people that have been on the show in a way that you can talk about what you do on your podcast. Like maybe even bring it up. Like, we did an episode one time that was about XYZ. So it's giving you that permission to talk about your podcast without explicitly saying over and over and over again, this is the name of your show. Because let's tie this in real fast, okay? My podcast is called the Profit Podcast. If that's all you heard, you probably wouldn't know exactly what my show was about, right? Let's just be really honest. You need a tagline. You need me to say who the audience is, or you need me to give you some examples of what the content is there that's going to be on the show if someone were to go listen to it. So while I think it's important that you name your podcast so people can actually go find it, I think it's more important for you to speak directly to the ideal audience that you have for that podcast, or the different topics that you've covered, or speaking specifically about an interview that you recently had with someone that's interesting on the show. Like, you would be so much more interested if this was the first time you'd ever heard from me. And I said, oh, you know what? People should really be more selective about the people that they have on their podcast, because I did this crazy interview one time, or I did a solo episode that was all about how to be selective with your guest. And it was mostly because I had these awful interviews at the very beginning of my podcast career because I was not selective. I just let anybody and everybody that pitched me come onto the show. And after a while, there was a lot of friction in my own experience. I was like internally screaming, this is a really awkward conversation. But externally, I just had to put on a brave face and make it through an interview. So over time, I realized, oh, I need to be more selective with who I let on my show. So everything that I just did there, I feel like that was like a scene. I just waved my hand in front of my face, like scene, and we're done. Because that's an example of how I could talk about that particular podcast episode. And if you're interested in that, you would say, you know what? I really want to go hear what she's talking about. I like the way she sounds. I like, her style. Maybe you like my accent. You love this Texas twang and you want to go hear all the other things I'm going to talk about. That's how you get someone interested in your show. You get them interested in you. It's not just about mentioning your podcast over and over and over again, because if they can't tell what your show is about from your name, like the name of your show, they're not going to care. They're not like, you need them to fall in love with you and the value that you offer. And I try to knock people's socks off. Whenever I go to be a guest on someone's show, I've actually had people say to me like, wow, like you just gave a masterclass, or you should be paying, like people should be paying you. You should be charging for the content that you just gave away. But y'all, that's my style. I like to go and blow people's socks off because I want them to come hang out with me on a regular basis. I want them to consume my content. I want them to listen to the podcast, get on my YouTube channel, go, subscribe to my email list, follow me on Instagram, engage in our Facebook group. Like, this is my goal. It's not to say, oh, let me come onto your podcast and I'll give you the first 3 important things, but the next 2, like, you're going to have to pay me for those. I'm not about that. That's not my style. I like to go above and beyond in over delivering content value. And I hope that you do as well, because it's just good karma. That's really what it all comes down to. It's really good karma. But that's all I have for y'all today. So show notes. Let's talk about this one more time. You can go see all these examples that I've listed here today at crystalprofit.com/episode 354. And I would love it if you would do me a huge favor. Could you take a screenshot wherever you're listening to this, whether it's on Apple, Spotify, Good Pods, wherever you're listening to this podcast today? Will you take a screenshot and share it on your Instagram stories and tag me? I'm at crystalprofittx. I would love to know what your number one takeaway was from this episode. So one more time, crystalprofit.com/episode 354 is the show notes for today's episode. But that's all I have for you. Make sure that you are subscribed or following this podcast wherever you are listening. And as always, remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere. Hey, Profit Podcast listeners. Thanks for sticking around to a little bit after the episode to hear this special message, because I want to hear from you. We are starting a new segment called Fan Mail Shoutouts, and I want to hear from you, and I want to hear your questions. What do you want to know? What questions have you been dying to ask me? So here's how to make this happen. Go to the app where you're listening to this podcast right now. Go there. I'll wait a second. Okay. Now, once you're there, you're going to see a hyperlink at the top of the episode description that says, send Crystal a text message. And that's all I want you to do. Send me a text. It could be casual, informal. It could be totally anonymous, or If you want, you can include your name and the name of your podcast or content wherever you are creating, and I will give you a special shout out in an upcoming episode. So again, go to the show notes for where you're listening to this episode right now, and it will say, send Crystal a text message, and I cannot wait to hear from you and give you a shout out in an upcoming segment of Fan Mail Shoutouts.